on the Rising Sun, a tragic tale of smuggling, slavery, and chocolate that he just published last year. His articles and reviews have appeared in the Journal of Global Slavery, Early American Studies, Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of Early American History, the New England Quarterly, the William and Mary Quarterly, and Commonplace. All of his peer-reviewed publications have examined economy, social structure, and global entanglements of the 18th century British and Atlantic world. So that is quite a list of accomplishments. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Kathleen, for inviting me. Thank you for the National Council of History Education for having me. This evening for you all. It's afternoon for me. I'm on the West Coast, so afternoon for me. Thank you all for coming and joining me this evening. I understand a number of you are from Michigan. I've seen it in the chat, and that's what Kathleen said. I'm a native Ohioan, so go Bucks. But my first. This evening, though, or this afternoon, I'm going to talk about my book, Mutiny on the Rising Sun, Tragic Tale of Slavery, Smuggling, and Chocolate. This book came out in October 2021. And what I want to do this afternoon is to tell the story of how the book came to be, what you can expect to find when you do have the opportunity to read it, and sort of how I kind of approach writing the book and kind of what I hope readers take away from it. Before I dive deep in, though, kind of talk about how the book came about, I want to give you a brief synopsis. I also have a PowerPoint I'd like to share to show you some images of the documents I read, some images that do appear in the book, and things like that. So the Mutiny on the Rising Sun uses, obviously, a mutiny and the murder of 4 people on board the schooner, the Rising Sun, a ship, in June 1743 to narrate what I call in the book a human history of smuggling. By doing so, it illustrates the place of illicit trade, of illegal trade, in the lives of people in early America and across the Atlantic world, ultimately demonstrating how illegal trade created demand for exotic products like chocolate and how slavery and smuggling were integral to the development of American capitalism. And so that's the kind of idea behind the book. That's my goal for the book. I'll kind of dive into that a little more as I proceed this evening. But let's dive in. Let's kind of talk. I want to talk about 3 things tonight. I want to talk about the research project that became Mutiny on the Rising Sun. I'm going to talk about how I transformed that research into a book and kind of the approach I took to the book. And then we'll give you an overview of the book and introduce you to the characters that you meet in the book, who they are, what they're up to, and kind of the kind of bigger purpose, my bigger vision I have for this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I hope everyone can see, and then we will go here. And oh boy, here we go. Play from start. Hopefully everyone can see that now. And this is the cover of the book. As I just showed you, the press did an excellent job. It's very ominous, which was the kind of the vision we were going for. So let's dive in. Kind of how did I get sort of involved in this project? How did I come to write this history about this random mutiny that no one had ever written about before? It's very obscure. It's kind of hard to recover in the sources. Well, it all started because of a relationship I had with this place here. This is the Old North Church and Historic Site in Boston, Massachusetts. Old North Church, founded 1723. It's on Boston's Freedom Trail today. It's still open to visitors. My understanding is that many of you are going to be going to Boston in June. I hope you have the opportunity to visit. Old North Church is famous today because of its role in the coming of the American Revolution. On the night of April 18th, 1773, this was the church, because being the tallest building in Boston at the time, where the lanterns were hung to signal to Paul Revere whether or not the British regulars on the morning of April 19th would be moving by land or by sea. So one lantern by land, 2 if by sea. And so this is the church. That's where it kind of shined from. And ever since that moment, ever since April 18th, 1775, this has been sort of seen as a birthplace, as a cradle of American liberty. And because of that, it is to this day it's a historic site, but it is also importantly for this story, it is still an active congregation. It is an Episcopalian church today, has an active congregation, just like in the 18th century, is an Anglican church, Church of England, and so it has that's a continuity from the moment it's founded in 1723 until today. It is still an active church, as an active congregation, an active group that rings the bells in the steeple and everything like that. And so in September of 2016, I was invited by Old North Church to give a talk about my first book about slavery in 18th century Boston. And in the beginning, I was sitting in the parsonage before my talk that in September 2016, and we're just kind of talking about what they're up to, how their exhibits that were on, and their and how and all their history of the church. And the vicar at the time asked me if I knew a man by the name of Newark Jackson. Newark, like the city in New Jersey, last name Jackson. And my reply is, well, who's that? I have no idea who you're talking about. And they said, well, you wrote about him in your book. And as it turns out, I totally had forgotten about this, that I used Jackson as an example of an enslaver in Boston, a man who owned enslaved people in Boston, in my first book, just kind of looking through I just kind of literally randomly picked him. And I said, oh, well, I guess I found him in the records, right? And I identified him as a Boston slave owner. Why do you ask? And they said, well, we opened a chocolate shop. In 2013, they opened as the sign says here, a historic chocolate shop that was kind of attached to their site. The shop was actually underwritten by the Mars Wrigley Confectionery Company, so of M&M's fame. They underwrote the shop and to open it, and the shop gave kind of historic demonstrations of chocolate. The public on the Freedom Trail could come in, they could see how chocolate was made in the 18th century, buy a little 18th century chocolate that had been developed by Mars and based on 18th century recipe, and kind of learn the history of chocolate in America. And this was a cornerstone of kind of educational programming for Mars, and increasingly within the kind of 3 years, by the time I first was there, it had become a kind of a cornerstone of Old North educational programming as well, and the interpretation of their site. And so they named this historic chocolate shop after Newark Jackson. When they were deciding on a name, when they opened the shop in 2013, they went through a list of their congregants in the 18th century who had connections to chocolate, and this is who they picked. They weren't, it was hard later on. I kind of asked, well, why did you pick this name? And the answer was that the name kind of rolled off the tongue, Newark Jackson. It just sounds good, right? It sounds good. And so they picked him. They did do their due diligence in that they hired a genealogical research firm to dig into Jackson's life. And out of that initial research, they kind of found 4 things about Jackson. The first is that he was a congregant at Old North Church. The second is that he was a ship captain. That's where Captain Jackson comes from, a merchant, and one of the first chocolatiers in Boston. And he lived in Boston in the 1730s and 1740s. He was married with 3 children. They found that information. And the 4th thing they found in the initial research was an apocryphal story. They weren't sure if it was true or not, but they find this story that he died in a mutiny off the coast of Suriname, a Dutch colony in South America, a Dutch plantation colony in South America, in June 1743. They weren't sure if it's true. It was hard to confirm. They didn't have any records to confirm it. It was just it was like a passing notice in a printed document, and they weren't really sure. When my initial research added a 5th piece that Newark Jackson was an enslaver. He owned enslaved people, and those enslaved people, he owned 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, probably worked in the chocolate shop. So that kind of added to the information. That's why they kind of brought me in initially. I was initially I was really struck by this story. Like, this is kind of fascinating. Who is this guy? The mutiny kind of caught my attention. He's a chocolatier. And one of the burning questions Old North had is, where was he getting his chocolate? Like, where was he getting the cacao to buy chocolate? And as it turns out, I have a friend of mine who is a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And I thought, well, if he's murdered off the coast of Suriname, I'll write my friend. And my friend does research, Carwin Fata Black does research on slavery and smuggling in Suriname. And he wrote a book about smuggling in Suriname, but he'd also he had built a database of all the North Americans, mostly New Englanders from Boston and Rhode Island and Connecticut, who went to Suriname to trade. And this is technically illegal, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so he built a database. So I just asked him, hey, could you query your database and see if this Newark Jackson guy comes up? And he said, oh, yeah, there he is. And I said, okay, problem solved. We know, we know this is probably where he's getting the chocolate, because Suriname, a plantation colony that uses enslaved African labor. That's the majority of the population in Suriname. They grow sugar, coffee, and cacao. And so it's like, that's probably where the sugar is coming, or the cacao is coming from. In the initial email I mentioned, I said, there's also this story that he was murdered in a mutiny. And do you have any information on this? And so he's like, no, I don't know. And about a week later, I received an email from him that said "murder!" And the murder exclamation point, he'd found the records of the mutiny. And here is just two of the pages of it. As it turns out, the mutiny was real, and the mutiny had been stopped, and the mutineers were put on trial. And so we had this huge trial record of the mutineers. And what you see here is an indictment of them, as it's in Dutch, is a Dutch colony. And here is one of the mutineers. He's being questioned. So his interrogation. So we actually had the records of the mutiny. And learning of these records, I realized that there was a bigger story here. There's probably more to this. These trial records kind of could open up a lot more for Old North. Didn't know what I was going to do with the research quite yet, but it opened up for Old North. And so there's a lot more information to be uncovered about Newark Jackson. And so we applied for I kind of continued talking to Old North over 2016 into 2017. And in summer 2017, we decided to apply for some grant funding to see if we can't do more research on Newark Jackson. And so we applied for and received another grant from Mars and the Mars Chocolate Company. And the grant's the Forrest E. Mars Jr. Chocolate History Grant. They gave us money, and we also received a smaller matching grant from the National Park Service to do research on maritime history. And so by late November 2017, we received all this grant money, and I signed on to be the principal investigator of the grant. So I had agreed to be the principal investigator and hired a multinational team of researchers, including graduate students in the Netherlands and Boston, to go out and look for evidence of Newark Jackson, to find more information about it. And so this began a process, and this research project lasted from late 2017 until late 2019, roughly speaking. And so what did we find? Well, what we found is that the mutiny was very real. Obviously, we have the records it left, the trial records, the official documents from the Dutch in Suriname regarding the Rising Sun, the ship that Newark Jackson died on, and her cargo could be used to tell a much larger story. We could follow all the people kind of involved in the case who are named in these documents, and we could follow them and kind of track them and who they were and what they're up to. And so what we realized is the mutiny actually served as a great starting point for some sort of larger story. Sorry, my dog's okay. So, could start as a larger story. So we started following the people, we started following the stories we found in these records, and we realized that something changed, that Newark Jackson moved away from the center of the story. He started to really move away. He was still integral to it, but he was not at the heart of the entire story. Excuse me, I'm sorry about this. My apologies. I am so sorry about that. He went crazy for some reason. So Newark Jackson, he was still part of the story, but he began moving away from the center. He's still integral, but not at the heart of it. And the reason for that is, as we followed these records, we found they really revealed wasn't so much just this guy's history, Newark Jackson's history, but revealed was an international cacao smuggling ring. And we can show that here. An international cacao smuggling ring that used New England ship captains and crews to traffic cacao from Dutch Suriname to the West Indian colony of Barbados. And the idea was, what they were doing is they were taking cacao out of the Dutch colony and the Dutch Empire and taking it to the British Empire, where essentially what would happen is, once it's landed in Barbados, it would be transshipped from Barbados to London or to Boston. And once it's in Barbados, it's kind of laundered. It goes into the British Empire and is thus a kind of legal product. Like I said, I'll come back to what smuggling is in a minute, but it's smuggling essentially. And you can see here what this smuggling ring looked like, right? So you go to Boston, to Suriname, to Barbados right here. Things go to London. There's a Newfoundland connection as they're buying and selling saltfish, and enslaved Africans are moving as well. And I'll come back to that piece of the story in just a second. The biggest, and also if you're wondering where Suriname is, it's right here. It is the modern day nation state of Suriname, right down here on the northern coast of South America, the northeastern coast of South America. The biggest find in this research came in fall 2018, when the research assistant I had hired in the Netherlands, whose name is Ramona Negron. She's now a graduate student at Leiden University, a PhD student. She found an inventory from the Rising Sun. So after the mutiny happened, the mutineers are put on trial. They're executed afterwards. And the Dutch government has to work through all the stuff they found, right? They have the ship, they have the ship's cargo, and they made two separate inventories. One is of the ship's cargo. And the thing is, we don't actually have that. That document disappeared. It's listed in an index and it disappeared. The other inventory that was made was of the ship itself. And so what's on board, so the ship's tackle, its sails, the personal effects of the captain and the crew, all of that was listed. And in that inventory at the very end was this. It is a list of enslaved people. They were on board the ship. They had been held on board the ship throughout the mutiny. And it's 15 enslaved people, 2 adult men and 13 children. And the Dutch words, and I'll butcher them, so I won't use them here. The Dutch words that are used here, jongens, that means boys and girls. They're probably adolescents, probably 8 to 12 years of age on board this ship. And they're on board. They've been trafficked. Discovering the enslaved people, we'd always sort of found hints as in the process of doing this research, right? We knew that Jackson was an enslaver, for example. Some of the other men involved in the smuggling ring were slave traders and enslavers themselves. We'd all the cacaos produced using slave labor. We always knew that there was a slavery angle there. But this really stood out and was a little surprising, actually. I was not expecting to find it so kind of there and kind of have to figure out, how does it fit into this story? What's going on? Because it completely changed the nature of the research project and eventually the way in which Old North tells the history of Newark Jackson. And if you're interested in kind of how Old North's kind of worked through this material and this story, I'm happy to take that in the Q&A. But it also kind of changed how I was thinking about it. And I'll come back to that in a second, because what happens is that Jackson was no longer this kind of quaint ship captain who has a chocolate shop named after him, right? But rather, he's a human trafficker, right? He bought and sold children and trafficked them across, away from their homes and everything they knew. And so, as I said, in retrospect, there'd been all sorts of clues about this, and certainly the connection of the people who are involved in the smuggling ring, like their connections to slavery. But this inventory really stood out and was really striking. And it's what brought home for me that slavery became the key to not only slavery became the key to understanding not only what sort of transpired on the Rising Sun, on the ship, but also in the entire smuggling ring. In fact, I would say that slavery was this smuggling ring's alpha and omega. Like everything comes back to slavery with it. So keeping that in mind, the way in which this inventory and the presence of those captives, African captives, children and 2 adults, probably young adults, the way in which that sort of stands out, it totally transformed my approach to this subject. So what I want to do now is kind of talk about how this became a book. How does this how do I transform all this stuff we found? We found stuff everywhere. We found stuff in the Netherlands. We found stuff in Barbados. We found stuff in Suriname. I found some stuff in Jamaica, in London, and in Boston, in Virginia. We found stuff in Rhode Island. We found stuff all over the place. So how did I take all this stuff that my research team and myself we found, and how did we sort of transform that into a book? The thing is, this inventory, though, for all the evidence we found, this inventory is the one that really kind of changed the game. Because what I knew from the moment as I started researching this, I had agreed as terms of the grant to write something, whether that was a report or what, we didn't know at first. But by the time we got through the research, I knew we got into the research, I knew there was a book there. And so what I had known from the beginning is the mutiny makes the perfect sort of angle, the perfect hook, right, to tell a larger story. There's just a problem with that. This inventory makes this a very different subject to write about than a mutiny does, right? This is a very serious subject, and we're talking about human trafficking. We're talking about the people involved in kind of human trafficking. We're talking about children's lives. And what I didn't want the book to be was some sort of sensationalist true crime thriller, right? I really wanted to avoid that angle, like that approach to writing it. And in fact, I honestly thought about writing it in that style, kind of because those court records I showed you, they're really gripping, and we have like blow by blow accounts of the mutiny and the murders that happen on board. So it would have been really great to write the sort of true crime thriller. The problem is, I worried that tone, that style would sensationalize and trivialize what was happening, the larger picture here, this issue with slavery. And so, what I ultimately wanted this book to be was less sort of like helter skelter, right? The true crime thriller, and more kind of hard history. And so that's the kind of approach I took, that the mutiny still can work as an angle for entering into this, a hook for better understanding this world. And it's going to be the frame for all of it. But ultimately, it's going to tell a different story. It's going to tell a story about slavery. It's going to tell a story about smuggling. And it's going to tell the story of all that's connection to chocolate. So the mutiny I saw it as an opportunity, right? Given this nature of smuggling, right? We have to remember that illegal trade going back and forth between these two empires was technically illegal. It created an opportunity because it tells a story that's oftentimes very difficult to see in the records. The mutiny is what historians we would call a contingency, right? It's something that was always kind of in the realm of possibility, but was not foreseen and had unintended consequences. And as part of those unintended consequences, it essentially creates a bunch of records that we can then use. That it opened a window, right? These documents, this generated by this mutiny, open a window on an 18th century smuggling ring. And one thing you should know about smugglers, right? They don't like to air their laundry. They don't like to show off what they're doing, because what they're doing is illegal. And so that's really hard to find in the records sometimes, despite how prevalent it was. It can be hard to find in the records. But here, right on display, in all these records about the mutiny, we have a window open to us, a window that, like I said, the people in the time period, smugglers, emphatically, deliberately shut. But here it's been open for us to view. So the mutiny does serve as a framing device but not the focal point. And the idea then is by using as a framing device, it allows the mutiny to remain central without descending into spectacle. So the other thing I had to do is kind of figure out why this matters historically. Why should random readers care about this mutiny that happened in 1743 with a bunch of people that no one knows? Why should people care? And here's just a quote I have from the book, if you want to take a look at it, as I kind of thinking about the way, the seriousness of the text there. I had to figure out why this matters, right? That it's serious in tone, and why does this matter historically? Because I knew a thriller would sell, right? People would be drawn into a thriller, but I wanted to actually use the mutiny to kind of make an argument about the past. And builds upon our understanding of the past and our understanding of this historical moment, kind of mid-18th century trade and commerce and slavery. I wanted something that really sort of contributed to that. And so my argument is that the book shows the intersection of smuggling and slave trading in early America. And that intersection, the way in which those two things intersect, is ultimately important for better understanding the early American economy and the rise of American capitalism. The reason for that is that conservative estimates are that more than half of all commerce in colonial America, so in what became the United States before 1776, more than half of all commerce in colonial America could be classified as smuggling. Now, in this time period, smuggling had a much broader definition than it does today. Most empires, be it British or French or Dutch or Spanish, Portuguese, they made it illegal to trade across borders. So you weren't allowed to trade outside of your empire, right? So if you're French and you can't go to the British Empire, if you're Dutch, you can't go to the French Empire, right? You can't trade outside. They made it illegal. And they also, and if it wasn't illegal, they placed very, very high taxes and tariffs on trade, outside trade. What this meant was that everyday commodities, things that we think of as everyday, coffee, sugar, chocolate, molasses, could actually be very expensive if you had to buy them within your empire. Because some empires aren't as productive as others. Some have all sorts of taxes and stuff on them that others don't. Some can produce cheaper and volumize better, right? And so because of the fact that everyday products could be so expensive, it sometimes made sense to smuggle. Right? If the French are producing molasses a lot cheaper than the British and you're a New England merchant, why not just go to the French? And what makes this so much sort of so much more prevalent is the fact that it's near impossible for these empires to enforce the law. Communication is very slow, right? For example, it took, if you would go to sail from Boston to London, it could take up to 3 months. Right. So you'd have to write a letter, send it to London to get a response if you're an imperial official, and wait for it to come back. A little faster on the way back, but you could wait anywhere from 4 to 6 months to get a response to a letter. The fastest ships in the 18th century went about 25 to 30 miles an hour, and that's in perfect sailing conditions. So it's really hard to enforce it given the limits of the slow speed of communication and the slow speed of sailing. So it's just easier for merchants to go drop in someplace, do a little bit of trade illegally, and go home. And the thing is, because this sort of smuggling, like I said, it revolves around everyday items. It makes those items cheaper in local communities. People will turn a blind eye to it. They don't think they think it's easy. It's better to get the cheaper commodities. The thing is, though, that's a story that's long been told, right? The role and impact of smuggling on creating early America, and especially the coming of the American Revolution, because Americans wanted to trade freely and the British said no, right? So this is a point of friction, and it's one of the things that blows up in 1776. But what's been missed in those discussions of slavery is that so much of what was smuggled, those everyday items, that sugar, molasses, coffee, cacao, was tied directly to slavery. Because enslaved labor produced those commodities. Enslaved labor processed those commodities, the sugar, the molasses, the cacao. They sold those commodities, right? And of course, so much of that traffic and that trade involved actual enslaved people, actually human beings, as the Rising Sun shows, being traded for these items. So that's what's happening in Suriname with the Rising Sun and this smuggling ring, is that they're taking captive Africans from Barbados to Suriname, where they're trading them for cacao, sugar, molasses, all things that are produced using slave labor. So as I said, alpha and omega for this smuggling ring, and really I would say alpha and omega for this world of commerce as a whole. And so really what I ultimately saw this as being is a good example, right, of our ability to, based on the nature of the documents and the sources created, to see what scholars call racial capitalism. Essentially, the smuggling ring relied upon the exploitation of racialized, enslaved others, namely Africans in this case, whose immiseration generated wealth that laid the foundation for a modern capitalist economy. So this is a story of a larger process of racial capitalism, which can roughly kind of be defined as the sort of expropriation and exploitation of the resources and labor of people of color to kind of generate a capitalist economy. And so this is one story of a much larger, much larger narrative, one narrative or one story of a much larger picture or story. So to get at all of this, to tell this bigger story, to make those connections, to look at that intersection between smuggling and slavery, I take a human approach, a human-centered approach, right? As I said at the beginning of the talk, this book is what I call a human history of smuggling. All the people who lived in this story, or who involved in this story or involved in this book, lived in a world where smuggling stood at the center of their lives. Whether they were the ship captain, whether they were a mutineer, a sailor, or one of the captives below deck on the Rising Sun, smuggling played an important role in their lives, shaped their lives. The case of the Rising Sun illustrates how forces, larger forces, created the conditions for smuggling, but these individuals on board, oftentimes driven by raw ambition or kind of forced there without their consent, oftentimes for the ship captain and the merchant on board have little regard for their consequences of their actions. These are the folks who design and impact and affect illicit commerce. And yet it's also important to remember that illicit commerce is routine because it is such a part of everyday life. It's just every day. People are trading illegally. It's kind of the nature of this world. So now that's kind of the vision I had for the book, is to try to tell a human-centered story and look at these really big processes, right? The smuggling of slavery, of capitalism, and the emergence of capitalism, right? And tie it to these individual people on board the Rising Sun. And so that's how I organized the book. And that's kind of what I want to talk about for the rest of my time here today. The book is a human history of smuggling, as I said, and I organized it as such. All the chapters of the book are centered around people involved with the ship. That not only includes those on board the ship, the captain, the crew, the enslaved children I showed earlier, but also other members of the smuggling ring, colonial officials in Suriname and Boston, and the widows of the men who died in the mutiny. So let's meet some of these people. One man you've already met is Newark Jackson. He shows up in the records quite a bit. And here he is, he puts up a newspaper ad selling chocolate, wholesale or resale. And down here is him trading in Suriname. This is an earlier voyage from 1736, where he arrived on the schooner Merry Christmas. And he arrived with one horse, one part, that's the Dutch word for horse. Because of the trade laws, Suriname would allow British merchants and ship captains, so from New England or where else in the British Empire, if they brought horses with them. The plantation economy of Suriname needed horses, so if you brought a horse, you'd be allowed to trade. Of course, that limited trade, that's what the government in Suriname wanted, was a limited trade. What it really did, it opened up for a much larger trade. That's why he shows up with one horse. He's not just trading one horse. He's going to be trading a whole bunch of other stuff, buying sugar and coffee and cacao to load on board the ship. We also meet the men who actually operated the smuggling ring. And these, the three men who are involved are this guy here, George Ledane. He is a Boston merchant. George Ledane, he's kind of one of the organizers of this smuggling ring. And Ledane was, like I said, born in Boston, merchant. He's on board the Rising Sun, and one of the mysteries of the mutiny is why he was on board the Rising Sun. By this point in his career, he's older. And so he should have probably, like many ship captains, what they do is they make a lot of money as captains. They retire to land as merchants. They open stores and stuff like that. They become merchants. Could never figure out why he was on board the Rising Sun, and he died in the mutiny. So he's one of the 4 people who's murdered. He organized a smuggling ring. He's on board the ship, and then he's murdered in the course of the mutiny. The second man is this guy here, Gedney Clark. And I would describe Gedney Clark as the godfather of the entire smuggling ring, of all of this. Gedney Clark, born in Salem, Massachusetts, so he's New England born, but he moved to Barbados as a young man. And very quickly, he intermarried into the kind of planter aristocracy there. So he's a slave owner, he's a plantation owner, and he's also a big-time merchant. He has connections to major London merchant houses that are part of this whole story. And he used his position in Barbados, his connections, including to the customs collector. It helps to be able to smuggle when you know the customs collector, right? Including the customs collector, to kind of operate this smuggling ring. And he is the main owner of the Rising Sun. He and George Ledane are the 2 main owners, but Clark owns a slightly larger share in the ship. And Clark, in this moment, he's still kind of up and coming in 1743. He's kind of up and coming. By the early 1760s, he will be, it's estimated, probably the richest, if not certainly one of the top 5 richest men in the British Empire. So he makes a fortune smuggling in illegal trade and enslaving people. He owns, by the 1760s, he owns plantations all over the Americas. He's very wealthy, and like I said, that's all built on the backs of slavery. He's also very hard to find in the records for being someone who's so wealthy. So when you see his name pop up, it's a big deal, because he once again, illegal trade, he deliberately hid himself where he could. The third person involved in the smuggling ring was this guy here, Edward Tottle. Edward Tottle was kind of fascinating backstory. He's born in New York. His father is an Englishman. His mother was a Dutch New Amsterdamer. So she'd been born in New Amsterdam, or in New York, when it was the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. And so he grew up in he spoke Dutch growing up. He's related to some pretty powerful Dutch American families, the Wendell family, most prominent amongst them, and through friendship to the Faneuil family of Faneuil Hall fame, if you're visiting Boston. And so in the 1730s, he moved to Suriname, probably because of his ability to speak Dutch. He moved to Suriname, and he served as a commercial agent in what's called a factor in the 18th century, a commercial agent or factor in Suriname for New England merchants. And so he's kind of on the ground. He owns this big, beautiful mansion in the capital of Suriname, Paramaribo. And he's the guy on the ground that's making this smuggling ring work. And so, right, he's the one that's taking goods on and off the Rising Sun. And he's probably the one trying to sell the enslaved people that they're taking off the Rising Sun to sell. Of course, in addition to these men who were organized, we also have to talk about the enslaved people who were on board. And so they get a chapter on board. And the problem was, like, what do we know about them? We know very little. We have their names in that inventory. We know there were more on board. So what happened on the Rising Sun is that Newark Jackson sailed to Barbados from Boston on a ship. I'm not sure what ship. And there in Barbados, he boarded the Rising Sun along with a crew. He hires the men who ultimately perform the mutiny, or the mutineers in Barbados. He places them on board, and he then purchases captives either from Gedney Clark, or Gedney Clark purchased them beforehand to put on the Rising Sun. I estimate probably about 40 to 60 total African captives are placed on board the Rising Sun and trafficked to Suriname, where they're then exchanged, sold for cacao and some other commodities. So how do we tell this story of the captives on board, where they're from, where they end up? And we use a lot of context. And so one of the things I realized is that the age of those children, about 8 to 12 years, actually matched the age. They probably came from the Gold Coast of West Africa, what's today Ghana, based on some other research we did. And what we realized is that this narrative here of Venture Smith, and Venture Smith was born in that same region. He in about the same time as these children. And later in his life, he's enslaved. He's taken to New England, where he became free. And then in the 1790s, he's in his 70s. He sits down and relates his life story. And so he's actually a child at the same time these children would have been in the 1740s. And he could speak vividly. It tells us the way in which that experience of captivity and enslavement just seared itself in the minds of enslaved people, because as a 70-year-old man, he could recount these stories from his childhood. And so he tells that sort of, so I used his narrative as a child of growing up in this region, of his captivity, to kind of what might it have been like for those children on board the Rising Sun. And I also talk about slavery in Suriname there, which was the fate awaiting most of the captives on board the Rising Sun. We also meet the rest of the crew on board the ship. And so we have all these sorts of documents related to the crew. This painting here, although having to do with Cuba, actually, is a depiction of a New England ship's crew. And it kind of shows us the diversity, both in terms of age, but also you have the African man here. It kind of tells us the diversity. And it's in this chapter we also meet the three men who committed the mutiny. These men, their names were Fernando da Costa, Joseph Perea, and Thomas Lucas were their names. And they were Portuguese speakers. They spoke Portuguese. They spoke Portuguese to each other. Fernando da Costa is from Portugal. We're not sure where Joseph Perea was from, but he speaks Portuguese. And Thomas Lucas, although he spoke Portuguese in this moment, was actually born in Italy. And he's mixed race. His father was white and his mother was an enslaved African woman born outside Venice in Italy. He'd been a sailor for a long time. These men had probably been they'd worked on slave ships and had probably been dumped in Barbados. And that's where New York Jackson hired them to serve on board the ship. Why they mutinied is the big question, and why, and we don't get a sense of motive. The one thing the court records don't care about is motive. They just want to figure out, they just trying to get them to confess to the crime in the trial in Suriname. So they don't talk about motive, but so I speculate a little bit in the book. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. They're ultimately, however, after the mutiny, the ultimate fate of the ship rests in the hands of the two ship's officers, a man named William Blake, he's the ship's mate and navigator, and a man named John Shaw. And John Shaw was the ship's bosun, so the kind of chief sailor, and he's in charge of all the equipment on board the ship. And John Shaw had been involved in the smuggling ring for quite a while. He could speak Dutch. He'd been on numerous voyages with the smuggling ring, working with Gedney Clark and George Ledane and Edward Tottle. And so he and William Blake essentially are the ones who stopped the mutiny. And you have to read the book to figure out how it stopped and what the aftermath looks like. But that's kind of, those are the folks that are involved. In the course of, reading about the mutiny and learning about this mutiny and everyone who's involved, I use it, as I said, as an opportunity to talk about a lot of other things, and readers will learn a lot of other things. They'll learn about New England's extensive trade with Dutch Suriname. So, for example, here is this is a British North American ship on the river right in front of the capital of Suriname. Here, this painting is a kind of famous painting commissioned by New England merchants in Suriname, painted by a Boston-born painter named John Greenwood in Suriname, depicting them partying in a tavern in Paramaribo in Suriname as they're there doing business. And then it hung, and the merchants are from Rhode Island who commissioned it. It hung in their office, right? Because they're kind of proud of this. And so it speaks to just how extensively connected this place that we don't think about at all today, Suriname, was to early New England and was really important to colonial to colonial New England. And we learn about how smuggling functioned. We learn about slavery around the Atlantic, and especially the place and role of slavery in cacao production. So here, this is a 18th century painting of a Dutch painting of a plantation, and here we have this. These are cacao trees here that you can see just in a painting. This is a map of a plantation, or a plat of a plantation called Fairfield, which was actually owned by New Englanders in Suriname, but it owned by New Englanders, and it grew cacao. And based on the records we have, it seems this is one of the places where they were getting cacao for the smuggling ring. So a plantation owned by New Englanders is providing cacao to New England smugglers to take back to, in part, to New England. So it's this kind of vertically integrated system once you kind of dig into the records. And this here is just a map of Suriname in the 18th century. It's turned upside down. Suriname faces northward, but it's turned upside down to better depict it. And you can see here, it's all these plantations. That's what those little squares are along rivers. And that's kind of how Suriname looked in the 18th century. And like I said, cacao is grown there. It is a supplementary crop. They mostly grow sugar, but it is a supplementary crop. You also learn about life for sailors and things like that. And so the book brings in all of these topics to try to better understand the history of smuggling, the history of slavery, the rise of capitalism, the role of race in the creation of capitalism, and all of that. And so what I want to do now is wrap up by reading just a little piece from the book for you to kind of see kind of why this matters and why I think it matters, at least. At its most basic, however, the case of the Rising Sun shows how smuggling and slavery positioned early Americans in the wider world. Whether it was investors, slave traders, planters, or consumers, the smuggling ring, despite revealing rifts and intra-imperial conflict, also had a binding effect on the British Empire. It provided cacao and other products to consumers while ensuring markets for African captives and salt cod. What is most fascinating, however, is that it reveals the deep entanglement with places beyond Britain, the British West Indies, and the future United States. For a case that had repercussions in the Anglophone world, Dutch authorities in Suriname created those consequences, cascading out from Fort Zeelandia, which is the center of Paramaribo in Suriname, in the heart of a colony where British subjects were largely forbidden, were a series of decisions that affected lives in Boston, Barbados, and London. And what of those lives? When Ferdinand da Costa, Joseph Pereira, and Thomas Lucas seized control of the Rising Sun, and William Blake and John Shaw fought back, their actions opened a window on a world that contemporaries deliberately and emphatically shut. That open window allows us to reconstruct a smuggling ring and examine the people who willingly or unwillingly participated in it. There's a captain seeking his fortune in stability, a merchant facing the Herculean task of managing and maintaining an illicit trade network, young men at sea for the first time, and seasoned sailors marginalized as racial and ethnic others and hardened to the terrors of seafaring life. And there were 15 young captives, stolen from their homeland, largely erased from the records, and pawns in everyone else's game. Nearly 3 centuries later, the case of the Rising Sun reveals not only a legal commerce, but also a deeply human history. It is a story of ambition, greed, coercion, desire, and ultimately tragedy. So thank you all so much. I'm happy to take some questions and talk more about the research, talk more about all the stuff we've talked about here this evening. I just love to hear your questions.
So James has a question in the Q&A, and he says he knows that the churches are important in shipping communities. However, he's never really heard of a connection with the church. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the Old North Church and how this connects to the smuggling story? Gefinitely.
So it seems that I call it in the book, Old North is the sort of social nexus of this whole thing. George Ledane, the guy who's organizing it in Boston, he was a leading parishioner at Old North. He bought a pew, he has all this stuff. So he's a leading parishioner. And he's using Old North as a place to recruit ship captains because so Old North is the newer of the 2 Anglican churches in Boston in the colonial period. And so any kind of ship captain up and coming, right? They're trying to make their fortune, trying to make their name. They go to Old North because they can still afford a pew. They still have a place. It's this gathering place for like-minded men trying on their make. And so it's the perfect location for George Ledane to recruit ship captains. And so it serves as this social nexus. It also plays the role of kind of philanthropy. So all of these men, Edward Tottle, George Ledane, Newark Jackson, Gedney Clark in Barbados, are donating money to Old North to build its steeple. They're buying pews. The peal of bells in the Old North Church is actually they're very expensive, like I think like 1,000 or 2,000 pounds sterling, which is a lot of money in the 18th century. The tide for the largest donors to those is Peter Faneuil, wealthiest merchant in Boston. He donates 100 pounds sterling. The other man who donates is Gedney Clark, right, from Barbados, gives £100 to buy this peel of bells. So what the other thing that's happening is that these men, remember, they're engaged in some kind, even by 18th century standards, kind of, shady activities, right? They're involved in smuggling, they're crossing imperial boundaries, that sort of thing. And so they want to maintain their standing in the community. They want to make sure that those around them know that they're honorable, reputable men. And so a way of doing that is donating to this institution. And so they're kind of laundering their reputations through it. I should also make note is that it's pretty clear, at least New York Jackson, who I have the most records on about this, is also deeply religious, right? His inventory when he dies, there's an inventory taken of his estate, and he owns a lot of books, and they're all kind of religious texts, he'd essentially, if he lived for another 30 years, he would have been a Methodist, essentially. So he's tied to that Anglican church, but he has this kind of evangelical inclination. So they are also religious men. Yeah.
That was a great question. Edward would like to know how much of your research extended into Africa, where it all started.
Yeah. So I had to follow, once I realized that this was a slave trading voyage, the question became, where do the captives come from? And so I actually followed the evidence backwards to Gedney Clark. Like, he's the guy who's organizing all this, and looked at his slave trading activities. How's he investing in slave trading? Who are his business partners in London? How they're investing in slave trading? And what I found was that in this time period, in the early 1740s, they've invested heavily in this kind of scheme called the floating factory, where they took this massive ship and they anchored it off the coast of what's today Ghana. And this served as kind of a permanent slave trading post. And so they would do business with the Fonte people on the coast, and they would buy captives, bring them to the floating factory, and ships would pull up, load, and leave. The idea was to expedite the whole process, because the slave ships, they have high mortality rates, both of captives and of crew. So the less time you remain in Africa, where the crew's exposed to various tropical diseases, the better. And so the idea behind the floating factory was that it would be a really rapid sort of way. And so almost all the captives then would be coming from the interior of the Gold Coast, of what's today Ghana. So they would be there'd be Akan, they speak the Akan language. So they could have been Ashanti, Akwamu. There's a couple other possible ethnicities that or nationalities they would have been, but certainly Akan speakers, possibly Fonte, and they would have then been trafficked off the floating factory to Barbados, and then probably pretty quickly put on board the Rising Sun. So they probably had not spent too much time in Barbados at all. They just quickly transshipped then to Suriname. So the African story goes kind of deals a lot with the sort of politics of the Gold Coast in this era. The competing kingdoms of taking, and how captive taking works, the merchants, the Europeans negotiating with Africans, the way in which Africans really kind of run the show. This is another reason for the floating factory to be off the coast. So they didn't have to, Europeans didn't have to deal with African politics as much, because they could kind of be told what to do. But yeah, so you have to go deep into the Gold Coast to really understand that part of the story.
Thank you so much. Barbara has a question. Were smugglers and pirates working together?
So this is one of the things I learned in the course of this research, is that smugglers are not pirates, and they're very definitely not. They don't want to be characterized as such, because the thing is, piracy brings attention. Smugglers don't want attention brought to them. Now, in an earlier era, you would find these crews doing a little bit of everything, right? A New England ship crew, say the 1660s or so, they would go to the Caribbean, they would do a little bit of illegal trade, a little bit of smuggling, and they'd also do some piracy, right? So they do a little bit of everything. By this era, so the 1730s, 1740s, there's a real, they really distance themselves from piracy, like, because by this point, there's been this huge crackdown on piracy. And if you're accused of, becomes a very public thing. And so, like, you try to avoid the association with piracy, because you're going to get a lot of trouble. The Navy will hunt you. It's not good. But the funny thing is, in this, the there's a lot of correspondence between Gedney Clark, the guy in Barbados, and his investors in London about the Rising Sun, because they're trying to get an insurance claim on the ship, and it doesn't work quite as well. It doesn't work out. So they talk a lot about this. And at one point, the merchants in London, the Lascelles family, the Earls of Harwood, who just made the news a couple of weeks ago because they want to, the current Earl of Harwood wants to do like reparations for slavery. The family's kind of finally started to kind of acknowledge this. But anyways, the Lascelles family says the Lascelles the two brothers, they call the mutineers, they call them pirates, which does actually technically fall under mutiny, does technically fall under the definition of piracy. So that's legally speaking, they were actually on the right footing to call them pirates. But yeah, so there is this attempt. Smugglers do not by this point want to be associated with piracy whatsoever, because that will bring trouble in a way that smuggling doesn't bring trouble.
Thank you, Jared. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So there are so many good questions in the chat, and I wish we had time to answer them all. But there is some curiosity on the chocolate shop in the name, if that has changed.
It has, yes. So there was a kind of debate what to do. The one rewarding part of doing this research has been working with Old North, right? That from the moment I kind of told them, we found this document and this is going to change everything, right? They've been willing and ready and willing to say, we have to confront this history. We have to figure out the right way to do it. And so what they did was they used most of 2019 to kind of begin to sort of organize all the research, think about how they want to address this. And then they did a big public forum in October of 2019 to kind of reveal the research. So I was there. I kind of just gave, kind of overview of the research, kind of like I did here. And then they also had brought in some other folks they brought in the bishop, right? It's an Episcopal church. So the bishop comes in, and she, African-American woman, she'd been a spiritual advisor to Barack Obama. And, she was there because it is an active congregation. And now the congregation kind of has to confront this history of slave trading and all of that. And so she kind of talks about the theological implications of confronting this. There are education lawyers there because they work a lot with teachers. And so to talk about how this is going to impact their education programming. And then one of their board members is there, and she was a trademark lawyer, and she raises the question, which gets to the chocolate shop, is about branding. What does it mean not to confront this versus what does it mean to confront it? And so that's going to change the narrative. And I saw Kristen just put in the chat that they've really totally changed it. So they into the chocolate shop. They first removed his name. Was the first thing they did. And then they sort of have kind of wound down the chocolate program altogether, and instead decided to focus their attention more on Old North's connections to slavery and also the sort of experiences of Black and Indigenous congregants that were at Old North in the 18th century, and its connections in later eras to anti-slavery, abolition, its place as a meeting place in the 19th century for that. And so they've kind of redesigned their interpretations coming out of this for doing that. And it's really remarkable what they've done. But yeah, no more chocolate shop at all, in fact.
Thanks, Jared. And if you wouldn't mind, just lastly, Jared, Kathleen, and I had a great conversation about an exhibit that is going to be in Boston this summer. Would you mind to talk about that just for a few moments? Oh yeah, absolutely. So sometime probably around Juneteenth, there will be an exhibit opening at Faneuil Hall on the history of slavery in Boston. I'm one of the curators for it, and it's in the basement and on the first floor. And on the first floor, it kind of focuses on the experiences of individuals who were enslaved in Boston and free Black people in Boston, and enslaved Indigenous people in Boston. And then downstairs, it kind of tells the broader history and context of slavery in Boston. So I highly recommend, if you're going to be in Boston, kind of middle of June and after, go check it out. It's pretty cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. You gave us a lot of food for thought. There were so many more questions. I feel like we need a part 2 of this webinar. But thank you again for being here and for joining us. I know all of our teachers really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great night. Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Night, everyone.